plaît, interdite bien.
Good evening. So today I wanted to discuss the concept that sewing machines are tools with an identity crisis. So, what do I mean exactly? Well, tools. Are there better or worse tools when you buy them? Certainly. Are there tools of wildly different costs? Certainly those exist as well. Are there tools which are better than their actual intended purpose? Yes. So you can have very expensive tools, very expensive screwdrivers just for screwing in a simple screw. And if you have a very expensive screwdriver, you wouldn't really want to use it as a chisel. Are there tools which are merely good enough? So they'll do the job, maybe not too many times, maybe lots of times, but they do the job, but they're just good enough. And indeed, these exist. So the identity crisis is really that furniture is one of the areas where sewing machines appeared. Okay? So if you think of televisions in the 1950s, right up until the late 80s, these were furniture. Now we expect televisions to be small, electronic, and rather disposable. Sewing machines, right up until the end of the 1960s, cost a fortune. And so these became furniture. In the house, you'd show them off proudly because you spent so much money. So you would see them decorated with gold decals, hand-painted, very elaborate cases, very elaborate tables they were in. These machines and the tables and all the equipment around them, they were made better than just doing the job. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of vintage machines continue to work today. They were over-engineered. Okay. So a question arises about whether or not a vintage machine is better than a well-made modern machine. There is no one answer to this because it depends on the measures that you use. So the true answer comes down to what you expect of your tool. Okay? For example, do you expect to use it very occasionally to repair something, to sew on a button, and as a result you would need to store it away on a shelf in a closet somewhere? If this is the case, then a £40 vintage cast iron sewing machine will likely be rather inconvenient and won't be necessarily the best tool for your needs. Not unless you're really strong and enjoy this lifting 40 pounds over your head. If you expect to sew a bridal gown for a friend and all the dresses for a large wedding party, your machine should hopefully survive if it's a modern construction. A warning though that modern machines do not usually have a straight stitch plate and as a result do not always sew fine fabric very reliably. That's not to say all of them, of course some do just fine. However, if you start wanting to make pairs of jeans or sew really heavy fabric, or leather even, on a modern machine, some will do it, some won't. And of course, if you want to sew wedding dresses for a bridal party, but this time on a vintage sewing machine, you are likely to have no problems whatsoever. And that's where we start talking about the differences between the tools. If you want to make a pair of jeans on a well-maintained vintage machine, you shouldn't have any problem whatsoever. Even modern industrial machines are not made to the standards that the vintage machines were once. Okay? But that quality comes usually with a price. So the vintage machines were very expensive and in the main very heavy. So the price you paid was weight. But if you're not planning on carrying it around with you everywhere, then the real weight of the machine should never be an issue. If you put it in a table, if it's somewhere easily placed, the weight is much less of a problem. So with that in mind, is there something that a vintage sewing machine cannot do that a modern machine can do? Keep in mind that some late vintage sewing machines do come with a stretch stitch. But if you're planning on sewing spandex all the time, then most vintage sewing machines are not going to be your perfect choice. Also, if you hate spending 10 minutes to oil a machine periodically, depending on how often you use it, it's not really an ideal situation to have a vintage sewing machine, unless it self-oils. Some machines do self-oil. So why is there a difference between vintage and contemporary sewing machines? Like with cars, contemporary machines are made with an obsolescence built in mind. That means you will need to have a new one at some point. People do not expect to keep their cars forever, and unless you're buying a Rolls-Royce or a Bentley, you do not expect to have your car forever. So as a result, people do not expect to have a sewing machine forever. Okay? The other thing is many people like new. And this is a very good concept as well. It's nice to have something brand new. However, disposable sometimes comes with a reduction in quality. Why would you over-engineer something that you know has a 10-year lifespan? The ultimate hope is that you have a modern machine which worked perfectly for many years, and loads of people have had this satisfaction. But with a vintage machine, which has been properly maintained, there is no question that it will perform perfectly for many years. So unless you really need the automatic thread cutter, an auto threader, an electronic embroidery features, hundreds of fancy stitches, and you are planning on sewing, you may find a vintage machine is preferable. Or in fact, if you just want something that sits in a corner and looks beautiful, again, a vintage machine is a piece of furniture. If you do not want loads of fancy stitches for embellishments, or if you do want loads of stitches for embellishment, and are planning on doing a great deal of sewing, you will most likely find that the best solution is to get a vintage sewing machine to do the straight stitching, which is the bulk of your sewing, and have an electronic machine to do the fancy stitches. In this way you can actually get the best result. Unless, of course, some of the vintage sewing machines have all of the stitches you want, like the Necki or the Singer 400 class machines have many, many stitches. Kenmore do as well, so do lots of the Japanese brands. Whatever your needs, I'm just delighted to be a sewer and to have the opportunity to enjoy being around and using these wonderful sewing machines to create projects, and I certainly hope you do too, whatever your preference. Thank you very much.